Okay, thank you, Andrew, for reminding me.
I just noticed.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
should really set it up so that it records when I start so I don't have to remember. So, a few years after the art and cinema thing, so post 1953, Belson and Henry Jacobs started the Vortex concerts. And in May 1957, the first Vortex concert was held at the California Academy of Sciences Morrison Planetarium. So somehow they've convinced the sciences that they should definitely do this. It featured new electronic music from avant garde composers worldwide, and I'll talk more about who those were later. Curated by the composer slash DJ Henry Jacobs, Vortex was described by Belson, the visual director, as a series of electronic music concerts illuminated by various visual effects. In the blackness of the planetarium's 65-foot dome, Belson created spectacular illusions layering abstract patterns, lighting effects, and cosmic energy, at times using up to 30 projection devices. So that sounds pretty amazing. Belson himself filled interference projector patterns, and I'll tell you what that is later, for Vortex, and later used some of those patterns in his films, Seance and Allures, and we'll watch Allures today. Vortex was an immediate success. People liked it. And 5 Vortex series were performed through 1959 with over 38 concerts. So that means that there were 5 different shows, and those 5 shows were performed a total of 38 times. Unfortunately, planetarium management did not share the press's and audience's enthusiasm and canceled in 1959. The Vortex legacy is evident in 1960 psychedelic live shows, live multiple projection shows, and VJ culture. So a pretty influential thing that most people have not heard about. We're more familiar with the Phillips Pavilion piece done by Varese and Xenakis, and for some reason the name is escaping me, the architect Le Corbusier. Are you guys familiar with the Poème électronique and the Phillips Pavilion? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about it briefly. So Yanis Xenakis, a composer and architect and mathematician, was working for Le Corbusier in France, and came up with this piece of music called Metastasis. But prior to that, came up with the architecture that that piece is based on. So it deals with hyperbolic paraboloids. What? So those are the things you make in elementary school, which are just basically curves made out of straight lines. So if you took 2 tongue depressors and you make lines that overlap, it kind of makes this curve on the top. But only out of straight lines, right? So did anybody do that in school? That's a 1980s thing maybe. I wish we could do it, but basically what you do is you take the 2 axes and you run lines like, so they cross each other, like this, like this, like this, like this, like this, and what you end up is with a curve like that. So anyway, that's kind of what he's using to make these pieces. So sonically, it sounds like string glissandi, and we will look at what the building looks like when you make it out of those sort of curves. So that building was this giant building in 1958, sponsored by the Philips Corporation, where people could go in, and Varese had written a piece for it, Poème électronique, and it had this building had 400 speakers with several channels, sponsored by Philips, so they had all the speakers and amplifiers they could want, and images were projected up on the walls. It was a big multimedia extravaganza, which overshadowed the Vortex concert attempt, which was also in Brussels at the same time, but experienced technical difficulties. And so if you've ever done something where you have gone somewhere and your show has failed, that's what happened to them. And basically that was the end of the Vortex concerts. So we can count that Xenakis and Varese and Le Corbusier and the Philips Corporation broke the spirit of the San Francisco crew.
So is the Phillips building still there?
No, they tore it down immediately afterwards.
Okay, because I was seeing that I'm looking at Wikipedia. It says the speakers were set into the walls, which were coated in asbestos, creating
Yeah.
a textured look to the walls.
Yeah. Well,
Perfect.
asbestos wasn't thought to be such a bad thing at that time. But yeah, it was torn down right after it. It didn't last.
The death building.
Oh wait, quick question. Didn't people used to eat asbestos? Is that the thing they chewed off their windows sills? Anyway, never mind.
I don't think
It
so.
might have, but the dust causes cancer. So when you're removing it or putting it in, it's actually fine when it's there, but if it flakes off, it causes cancer.
It's the small particles, I think.
Right. Well, I know that. I just meant there was something in the like 50s or 60s that people used to gnaw on, and
Probably
then
lead.
It
probably.
sounds like paint.
Anyway, back to music. Sorry.
Yeah. So anyway, that was a little bit of a. So so the management didn't really like it. They canceled it. Belson and Jacobs tried to remount Vortex, but were unable to find a venue and sufficient backing. So, for those of you that have done similar things, you're not alone. In October 1959, Belson and Jacobs presented a concert of electronic music and non-objective film called Vortex Presents at the San Francisco Museum of Art. It was a very different single-screen event. Belson screened early versions of the films he was working on, including Allures, plus films by others, and one evening, only one evening, expecting a multiple projector planetarium show, people came. They wanted the big Vortex experience, and they just saw it was on a screen, and they were like, "Meh, this isn't so great." They were disappointed. The Vortex concerts were crucial to Belson's transition to a new style of filmmaking, and he stopped using traditional animation techniques and began working with pure real-time light sources. Okay, so that's sort of a biography of Jordan Belson and sort of a lead-in to what the Vortex concerts are. And maybe it's a good time now to, maybe it's a good time now to just check out one. So, because it's hard to know what we're talking about without seeing it. So, let me dial up Allures. And you'll have to give me a moment here.
I was looking at pictures from those videos, and it looks pretty cool.
Oh, yeah, it's amazing. We did, as part of the Seamus conference here, we did use the planetarium. So I had a call for works for the planetarium. But they use a very specific system, right, that you can project. So it's very high resolution. They use several projectors. I think it's 8 projectors or more. And you have to go through this very specific way of doing it so that the computer can chop up the images to be displayed only by one projector. And so it's not nearly the free-for-all that was possible at the Morrison Planetarium. It was still interesting, and they do have a 5.1 surround sound system in our planetarium. It's a cool place to present, although I find the chairs a little bit uncomfortable. Has anybody been to the planetarium?
Nope.
I really want to go.
Yeah.
Which one?
I doubt they're doing anything now. Unfortunately. All right. Yeah, but it's really neat. They show, films there that are made for planetariums. There's a whole genre of planetarium films, most of which are things like about outer space, obviously, but then there's some that people like to go see, which usually involve 70s rock bands, so like Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. People like that. They don't show a lot of Jordan Belson.
I remember back at Barron, we actually did, like, I think it was like one of my last classes that I took there. We actually did like an old film restoration project that had that was for the planetarium on campus. So we had these old like film squares, and we scanned them and uploaded them and turned them into a video.
Oh wow!
And it was like this old like it was this old like Christmas program, and it was all automated. It was really cute.
Yeah, they do a Christmas thing at this planetarium. It's very, kind of cliche,
yeah.
Pixar-ish. digital film, but not nearly the quality of Pixar. Okay. Good grief. Okay. Good grief.
Good grief.
I was telling Andres earlier, I come back to my office and it's just, I always run out of here a little bit late. And so I come back to this chaos of a desktop and
no.
everything's open. All right, so I'm going to queue this up and then I'll share the screen. I had to hunt pretty hard for this. Last time I was able to rent it through the Center for Visual Music, but now they have stopped renting the film. So I'll have to get it some other way. All right, so let me say before we watch this that what's interesting to me and to this class about Jordan Belson is that he makes the audio and visual things himself. So there is no, I'm going to pay somebody else's audio underneath this. They are meant to be viewed together. So really, for me personally, this is a very large influence. We don't know how he's doing anything he's doing, which makes it more fun in a way. But obviously he's got some interesting experimental techniques. So I'll share the screen here and share the sound. And watch our bootleg copy of Allures, 1961. Thank you, State Library of Pennsylvania. Okay. So that's one version of Allures. That's pretty lo-fi compared to what you can get to the Center for Visual Music. The the warbling sound we hear is not necessarily meant to be there. So there's a little bit of warble. But that warbling may give you a hint as to how that sound is being produced. What's your guess?
Tape.
Yeah, definitely tape, right? So we're 1961. At this point, you can get tape machines. Apparently, he's got one or two, and doing some feedback effects.
In this era, like culturally, was this kind of an optimistic time period? Or were they really because this is pre-Vietnam, U.S. is doing great, and so they're kind of like, well, let's just experiment with this medium. Or were there a lot of like really politically motivated, or like reactionary things to the state of the world? Or was this more just like, let's explore consciousness?
This is let's explore consciousness. This is totally free from any connection to the world. This is about human experience. So like he said, like there's like, we see this sort of thing that looks like an atomic bomb thing. That's a shape, right? He has no, if you're Jordan Belson, he's like, well, that's just because it's three circles that are on different axes. I mean, that's what that is. There's no symbolism, right? So what reappears in Belson's work, a lot of these sort of flaming sort of sphere circles, it's very cosmic looking. So his idea is about exploring inside and out, right? Yeah, inner consciousness, outer space, those connections. It's pretty interesting. And this time in the United States, at least in California, in San Francisco, 1961, we are on the cusp of the sort of cultural counterculture revolution. And so he's part of that. Okay, so obviously now that you've had a little background in where this comes from, you can see lots of influences here. So obviously there's some James Whitney influence there, and some John Whitney influence, right? So John Whitney, at the same time as this, right, has released his catalog. So there's no doubt that Jordan Belson has seen all these things. He's in the know, he's in that time, and he's using similar techniques, you could guess, but along with some other pretty different things. So we start getting this sort of gaseous sort of look at some point in that film, which becomes a harbinger for lots of things to come. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the Vortex concerts, and then we'll get back to more of Jordan Belson. So Henry Jacobs and Jordan Belson were doing the Vortex concerts, and like I said, Jordan Belson was in charge of the visual stuff, and Henry Jacobs was also a musique concrète composer, and so he was doing sort of the sound organization. The Morrison Planetarium had a 38-speaker sound system with 4 separate tracks for playback. So you had 4 channels of sound distributed over 38 channels. Diffusion across 38 speakers was possible and gave the possibility of creating a spatially swirling sound. Hence, they called it the Vortex concerts. The visual projectors were more numerous than that and featured star projectors, so projecting stars in a planetarium sense, kaleidoscope and zoomer projectors, strobes, slide projectors, rotating prisms, 16mm film projectors, and interference pattern projectors. So Belson would use up to 30 projectors to create an immersive visual experience that attempted synchronization with spatialized electronic music. So that's why it's quite relevant to this history that I'm trying to navigate.
What year was that? When did that happen?
These are like 57 to 59.
It seems really early for the spatial audio stuff.
Well, kind of, except that it's not. So Stockhausen, with his Gesang der Jünglinge, which I think is 1957, also was experimenting with spatial sound. So it's in the ether, as they would say. People are doing this because there's tape, early tape machines, and these tape machines were like 4 tracks in some cases. The music presented at the Vortex concert is worth noting due to its foundational relationship with current electroacoustic music. So when we talk about electroacoustic music that's presented these days at conferences like Seamus, or I guess even in popular music, in a sense. The Fifth Vortex concert in 1959 featured these works: A Piece for Tape Recorder by Vladimir Usichevsky, who was somebody who taught at Columbia. Sky, Horse, and Death by Toru Takemitsu. Hopefully you're familiar with Toru Takemitsu, a well-known 20th century composer. Omaggio a Joyce by Luciano Berio. Articulation by Yorgi Legedi. Continuo by Bruno Madeira. And Etude au Sens Tendu by Luc Ferrari. So those are really big names here being showcased in a single place with really interesting visual accompaniment. I think that's really an overlooked historical thing that happened. I mean, it's bringing together some big heavy hitters here. The end of these Vortex concerts came about due to the failure to recover from a disaster of a showing at the 1958 World Fair, where they had the Poème Electronique in the Phillips Pavilion. The audio side of Belson's work demonstrates the influences of those Vortex concerts, so the tape music that I just mentioned. Belson produced the audio in collaboration with Henry Jacobs for Allures, so he had some help from an electroacoustic composer. In interviews about the sound portion of the film, even though he doesn't give interviews, his description of the musical process describes pre-recorded sound and suggests the methods of musique concrète. So Belson brings together the electroacoustic music and abstract animation techniques. His ability to work across the media marks him as an early electroacoustic audiovisual composer. So here is our sort of foundational person in my narrative, right? This is the guy, Jordan Belson. He's the one that, for me anyway, is like, he's got it. This is it. Now, in other ways, it's not there because there's nothing really underlying these two media except sort of a connection to content, which is sort of exploration of consciousness. So I would call that multimedia. So the aesthetic of Jordan Belson is influential in my own work. So I have a piece called Streamstone Surface that I'll just post, and you can look at it if you want to. Belson leads more towards James Whitney and his intuitive guidance of the audiovisual structure, as opposed to John Whitney's formal constructs that would lead him to explore underlying mathematical principles. Jordan Belson isn't really interested in that. Belson's work seeks to represent inner consciousness. And so you can look again in Expanded Cinema, Gene Youngblood's book that I had you look at last week, for more on Jordan Belson. He's got a whole chapter devoted to cosmic cinema. Jordan Belson says these things in the few quotes we have for him. He says, "I first have to see the images somewhere, within or without, or somewhere. I mean, I don't make them up." That's an interesting thing to hear, having seen what we just saw. So for him, this is something that's within him, like he sees maybe when he closes his eyes. He says, "I'm interested in what underlies reality." So again, back to this sort of non-objective painting idea. But we don't really have a tight coupling of audio and visual elements. Although in Allures, I do notice that when things are more pointillistic, there's a shift where the little dots come, and right there, the music and the image isn't tightly coupled, but they do relate. So there does seem to be some sort of attempt to correlate the two things. All right, so let me close down Allures here. And so here's what I think is interesting about Belson. He gives this quote about Allures in 1961. He says about this particular piece that we just watched, "The more I continue to work in films, the clearer the idea becomes that movement is inherent in graphics, even in still graphics. So even in a still image, there is inherent movement. And I will have you look back in your mind's eye to the Kandinsky thing we looked at before." Right? To me, there's inherent movement in that painting. And Belson talks about other ways that's possible. So it also harkens back to Fischinger telling John Cage that every object, has some sort of spirit within it, right? Here, Belson says that every graphic has movement implied. Many of the means by which I've obtained motion on film, especially in my newer work, is a matter of extracting motion from designs that were not intended for that purpose, but just normally contain motion if one knew how to release it. And that reminds me of rotoreliefs by Duchamp, which we'll look at in a second. It almost sounds like atomic physics. It's something like that in a sense. So interference patterns offer an excellent example of a means by which the latent inherent motion in a form or in a composition can be suddenly animated by the simple device of passing a similar pattern over it. So let's look at what we mean by interference patterns, because this is some ripe material to exercise in a program like Maxim SP Jitter. So let me share this here. And let's look at the interference pattern. Whoops, not that. So this is an interference pattern here, right? So we have two circles, just concentric circles, and as we pass them over each other, we get the interference between the two. So much like how sound waves interfere with each other. And if we were to do this in some sort of way where we took these two things and passed them over each other in time, these moire patterns, which sometimes appear on my shirts in Zoom meetings, happen, right? So these two circles by themselves do not imply motion, but as we pass them over each other, like things will happen here that are quite interesting, and Belson is really into that. Rotation of the sort Duchamp did with his discs is another example of how motion can be derived from static material. So let's take a look at what he's talking about there. These are the rotoreliefs. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these. They're not covered in music school very often, obviously. But let me find both an image and a video. Okay, share the screen. So here is a still image, right? Here it is. And there is motion inherent in this, right? So we see, if you've ever seen spirographs, they're basically different geared circles that you can draw with. And as you spin these things around, they have a motion to them. So you can actually print these out and put them on a record player, and it looks pretty cool. Let's take a look at a rotorelief here. Lucky for you, you can't hear the music. So there's the spinning rotorelief, right? If you put this on a record player, then somehow there's this interesting motion that's happening here. This is what Belson is talking about when he talks about Duchamp's work and the inherent motion in still image. Okay. Zooming in on a perfectly static form makes it suddenly grow a form of motion. Motion is an inherent part of graphics, whether the artist is aware of it or not. It's almost as if it were an element concealed invisibly within a form. And probably the most important thing I'm doing in films is finding ways of bringing that out, which might be one reason I don't want to animate anymore, because animation is imposing motion, right? Animation is imposing motion as opposed to bringing it out of the object.
Kind of. It's still images that when you...
Well, you're having to force them, right? I guess you could argue that rotation is an animation. But to draw a ball rolling down a ramp, right, you kind of have to fake it.
Well, this reminds me of that Bauhaus video I just watched, that movie, and they made these like geometric ballets because they felt like a triangle would move a certain way, it exists a certain way, and a rectangle, and like the way they interact depending on what the plane they're in the dimension, it's really cool. And there's like a guy who would dance specifically. I mean, it was like breakdancing kind of, but in like these geometric patterns, and then they put him in a building that was designed to be like hyper ergonomic for the human form. So it's the perfect venue medium for him to like do this very niche thing, and it made so much sense. And so I've been seeing that where there's like a motion to geometry.
Yeah, I think I've told you guys this story already, but I'll repeat myself. So when I was in high school, I went to this drama class, and there was a guest presenter, and he came in and he did this very odd poem about Buffalo Bill, defunct, 1, 2, 3, 4 times, something really weird. And I was like, oh, this is totally bizarre, you know. And I was like 16 years old or something.
Was it the E.E. Cummings poem?
Probably. And he was performing it. So then he asked somebody, one of my friends, to take this pen. He says, okay, so this pen, I'd like you to move it through space like it's supposed to move. And he did something like, he made it like a creature. And he said, well, that's neat, but I really just meant, like, how does it want to be in space? And I still remember that because I was like, I have no idea what he's even trying to say. But now I do. And I think it's what Ryan just hinted at. That objects themselves have this sort of tendency. And especially images themselves, if you find the right ones, have some sort of motion inherent in them that you can bring out. And the reason I think that's important for us is because I've introduced you to JIT.Rota, which does all of these things, right? This one little object could create a lot of the things we've looked at, because in many ways, the experimental film of the time does in large part deal with zooming in, rotating, and offsetting. That's where it is. Okay. I also mentioned kaleidoscope projectors. So let's take a look at what those are. And in the links in Folio, I've linked to a site that you could do a DIY kaleidoscope projector if that's your sort of thing that you might do for fun. Is how do I make one of my own at home? Well, you could. So let me share the screen again. So this is what a kaleidoscope projector looks like. So we have these sort of patterns. And again, with our bound mode 4, was it? In the JIT.Rota, we can achieve similar effects to this. Okay, so we've become a little more familiar with the sort of things that Belson was using in the Vortex concerts, and then we have to view later what happens when he's not in the Vortex environment. He doesn't have access to kaleidoscope projectors, all these dozens of different star projectors and whatnot. So then he starts making film, influenced by all of that, but has to figure it out on his own. And I thought earlier, I said, what did this guy do to survive? And I don't actually know the answer to that. Maybe he was wealthy somehow. So we don't know exactly how he worked, but his works to me seem to unfold by producing the images first and then composing a soundtrack, which is kind of the opposite of what we think of with music videos, right? Where we have some sort of soundtrack and we put images to it. But remember that Belson is an artist, a visual artist first. And so in my imagination, I can only believe that he's making the visual music and then setting sound to it. And so for myself, I have also done that to try to explore it, which forces you to impose musical form on images and then later to go back and put music to it.
Like really hard Foley work.
Yeah, kind of. Without having any sort of reality or scene or story to go on, just a sort of abstract imagery. Okay. All right, so I think we can maybe watch one more Jordan Belson video here. So this one's from 1967. And so, oh, and I wanted to point out that I did put an edited video up because I made lots of mistakes last time saying things. And one mistake I did not correct was I said that Whitney's stuff was shown in The Right Stuff. That is incorrect. It's actually Jordan Belson's work that is shown in The Right Stuff. So there's this moment in The Right Stuff. That's a video about when they broke the sound barrier with planes and all that. And there's this moment, as I mentioned last time, when the plane is going into the, like almost into outer space, like the first layer. And thinking about what that means for humans and human consciousness is interesting. And also what happens in the movie is that he's going into the great beyond this way and is losing consciousness. And so they used Jordan Belson's imagery there to sort of go into the unknown. So that's kind of this, in a sense, the way that some people can interpret this aesthetic is like exploring the unknown in image. Okay, so let's watch Samadhi from 1967. That did not redirect me very well. Okay, let's share here. Whoops. Okay, I got it. And okay. Got confused. All right, here we go. Okay, well, there it is.
Loved it.
Jordan Belson. And what's interesting to me about that is if you go back and look at Wilfred's light pieces, which are actually ongoing even through that time, I believe, there's a remarkable influence there. And what I also like about this particular point in the semester is that you can see with this 1967 piece that we're in territory that's a little unlike what we've seen before. It has definitely gone to a different place. There's a lot of this sort of gas cloud dissolving non-geometric stuff, which is, you can see his growth toward that, which is an interesting development. And also looking at the earlier pieces, we can definitely trace back the lineage. So we become a little bit more familiar with what the aesthetic is of visual music. And here with Belson, we're getting the bonus of someone creating their own audio to go with it, which is our ultimate goal, is to continue this sort of thread of, can we link audio and visual things together in a way that makes sense? And with that, I don't have any more information to feed into your ears. Anybody have any comments?
The video looked like an episode from Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
Almost identical. Episode 8, after the atomic bomb blows up. It looks just like that video.
Interesting.
I can link it in the comments if
Really
anybody wants to
loose with
watch
your
it.
Twin Peaks spoilers, man.
No spoiler.
They've been many times. I know I'm watching it slowly.
So I really like it's almost like it went from being lost in the woods to looking at the sun at one point, because I love the idea. I like things for me to focus on because I have ADHD. But there's this, when it turned into like a circle, and you saw like a haze around it. It literally looked like you're just looking straight at the sun, but not having the blinding effect.
Right,
Damaging your eyes.
like an eclipse, right?
Right, and that was just, and it was weird because it wasn't the colors of the sun. It was like green, and then it turned to like, it was different color, like blue and stuff. So it was interesting.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting to think about is before we've seen things, and I can kind of imagine in my mind like, oh, well, we could do that. We could make those sort of images this way, right? And now I'm looking at this 1967 piece and saying, how would we go about achieving that? Um, you know, it's almost like the analog tape argument versus digital recording argument. Like sometimes there's just a sound you can get from saturating tape that's different than you can get in any other way. Sometimes there's working with analog film, you can achieve things that are very difficult to achieve in a digital way. But we can be wowed by the interest and the sort of feel that gives us. It's pretty tangible in some way, and the color choices are remarkable. Obviously quite an artist. All right, so let's discuss what there is to do. What I'd like you to do is I put a bunch of notes up there on the Folio site, just pretty much what we talked about today, but I put them in, and I'll put one more note, the thing I read from, actually it was the San Francisco Museum of Art. I'll put that there. And I think, yeah, so I put some notes there, and I put links to the Belson videos that we have. If there's some interest, we can have a viewing party of Chakra. I will happily rent a Belson movie or two. You know, they're like $4 or something like that. You can buy the DVD for $30, which is probably what I'll end up doing, so I don't have to hunt so much through, you know, Russian bootleg sites to find what we need. Yeah, so I put those there, and basically you're charged with just reviewing those things and being familiar with them. There is a chapter, like I said, in the Gene Youngblood Expanded Cinema, but I'm going to not assign that this week because I want you to, if you did not do the reading for this past week, I want you to catch up a little bit. If you did do it, then you have a little lesser load. But the point of these things is to inform ourselves from a creative standpoint about where we're coming from. And so in a sense, you know, there's the way best to do that is to kind of understand why and then look at how that's occurring. And so really watching these videos is probably the best thing we can do. Much like studying music, sometimes the best thing to do is just to look at the score and listen to the music. We could talk about it all day, but in the end, the thing is the thing. All right, so you are on an exploration week this week with Jitter. There is no assignment on Thursday that's due to Folio, so you are just, if you can...
There's the readings of the tutorials.
Oh, there's the readings of the tutorials. That's right. So make sure to do the tutorials. I'm trying to, as opposed to last semester, I had some complaints about the workload was a bit insane. So I'm trying not to do that, but don't think that it's that I don't want you to do anything at all. I want you to do this on your own. But evaluating that is not a high priority for me to assess it. But at some point, I am going to put out there some sort of quiz where you can fill in the answers just so that that you know what it is that I think is important to know. All right, and with that, that's all I have for you today. So I will see you in a couple days, if not sooner.
Thank you.
Thank you.